Chapter 6. "Will you be needing anything else, Miss Clara?" Yana asked. "No, thank you," I yawned sleepily. "Please tend to Fritz and find your bed soon after. I'm sure you're exhausted." Yana bowed her head and scurried out of my room. She was a little younger than I was and fairly new to our household. This was her first Christmas with us for the famous Stahlbaum party, so I was sure she would need a good night's rest after the celebration. I only hoped that Fritz took it easy on her. The rooms below were finally beginning to quiet. The last of the carriages rolled away through our main entrance, the sounds of their large wheels crunching against the building snow outside. Moving to my window, I slid my warm hand against the frosted glass. Tomorrow would bring anything but happy Christmas tidings to our household. I could almost imagine the tense breakfast table, with Lord Yakov sitting proudly at the far end. What did he hope to achieve? How could he possibly have any sort of interest in me when I hadn't shown a speck in return? He had not said a kind word about me in passing, especially as he was leaving. If only Uncle Drosselmeyer had been waiting and listening. What would he have said? What would Anton have thought of that? I could tell him on our walk tomorrow. He would be amused, I thought. I turned and glanced at my kempt bed. The white lace blanket was folded back nearly perfectly. The white sheets were clean and inviting. Yana had even placed a bed warmer underneath my covers for the brisk chill in the evening air. Despite the comforts provided, I couldn't shake away the thoughts of Lord Yakov and what the morning could possibly bring. I felt my cheeks burn at the thought of Anton witnessing such a fiasco. Anton. I simply could not shake him from my mind. The memory of our shared moment in the servants' hall sent another sliver of pleasure down the length of my back. He had been so kind, so understanding and gentle, and the Nutcracker, my protector. I peered around the room, realizing I had left the Nutcracker downstairs in my mother's cabinet. Despite my silent vow to return for him, I had forgotten. It was probably best to bring him to my room before Fritz got his hands on him and made him the next leader of his infantry. No doubt he would be beyond ruin then, for Fritz was twice as reckless as I was with his belongings. "Nutcracker," I whispered softly as I donned a warm dress robe over my chemise and fur slippers. As I walked to my bedroom door, the wooden floors creaked beneath my feet. I tried my best to walk slowly and carefully, so as not to wake the rest of the household. Papa would surely scold me for disturbing them all to fetch a doll. Taking the nearby candle Yana had left on my washing table, I turned the doorknob and found the house in almost complete darkness. A few oil lamps were left lit, their flames low near the staircase. But as the last of the servants were heading to bed, the light in the house began to slowly disappear. Tiptoeing across the long hallway, I managed to arrive at the edge of the first step. My way was guided by the candle and what little light the moon reflected on the snow outside our windows. Everything was still and quiet at the bottom of the stairs, all except for the gentle clicking of the grandfather clock in the parlor. I held my breath as I carefully descended the stairs, focused on remembering which steps creaked the loudest. I could see the faint, white paint of the cabinet in the distance. As I reached the last step without second thought, I dashed to it, drawing open the doors and reaching for my Nutcracker. He was just as fine as I had left him. His smiling features gleamed in the dim candlelight. "I sincerely apologize, Nutcracker. I forgot about you," I whispered as I held him out for another brief inspection. I felt slightly foolish for talking to a wooden Nutcracker, but there was something about him that made me believe he could hear me. He was so familiar, though I was sure that was simply because of the story I had recited earlier that very evening. "Come," I continued. "I'll take you to my room. Perhaps together we can both rest." As I turned on my heel, I saw the Christmas tree in the corner of the parlor room. Even in the darkness, it was beautiful. The candles had been long extinguished by the servants, but the tree still glittered in the dim glow of my candlelight. Our tree was always magical. Each year, Mama and Papa always managed to purchase the best tree in our village, large enough to make me feel like a doll as small as my Nutcracker. I took a step closer, suddenly struck by the memory of that long-ago dream, the boy who had worn a bright crimson jacket, inviting me to a land I could no longer name. I reached out with my free hand and brushed a fingertip over the needles of the tree. The crisp, piney scent filled my nose as I closed my eyes and smiled. I wanted nothing more than to remember this night, always. Another magical Christmas Eve at my home. The sound of the clock ringing from the other room startled me, bringing me back to the darkened room and the dripping candle in my hand. 3 soft tolls of the clock. Ding, ding, ding. As I turned to glance at the grandfather clock, I could have sworn I saw the faint image of Uncle Drosselmeyer behind it. The long wooden columns of the clock appeared to impersonate his form. On top of the clock, a wooden owl hovered, and with each toll of the clock, the automation flapped its wings, indicating the time. Then, in the blink of an eye, Uncle Drosselmeyer perched himself atop the clock, lingering behind the owl. "Uncle Drosselmeyer?" I whispered softly, taking a step away from the Christmas tree. I strained to see through the darkness, hoping to make out a clearer picture of him. My mind scrambled to make sense of what I was seeing. He lifted a finger to his lips as if to quiet me, and eagerly began to flap the edges of his midnight black cape, imitating the movements of the owl's wings. A slight wind blew the flame of my candle out, leaving me in the darkness with him. The same sort of sparkling dust Uncle Drosselmeyer had used at the party erupted from the pockets of his cape, covering the floor around him. "Uncle Drosselmeyer, what are you doing?" I called up to him more urgently. How had he gotten up there? More importantly, why was he there? Suddenly, the clock began to toll again. The hands on its face began to twist back, round and round, until the 2 golden arrows were pointing to midnight. As I looked back to my uncle, I realized he was gone. "Clara!" His voice echoed around the room, causing me to turn in circles. My extinguished candle fell to the floor with a clatter by my feet. Uncle Drosselmeyer was standing just behind me. I took a step back as I came face to face with him. "The Nutcracker," he said as his hand reached for the figure in my arms. His fingers were quick, tugging it out of my grasp. Before I could protest, Uncle Drosselmeyer pushed against my shoulder. The strange force from his hand sent me reeling back into the sofa beside the decorated tree. "Uncle Drosselmeyer!" I cried out, alarmed. What was he doing? A surge of conflicted tears formed in my eyes as I sat up. "You must break the spell, Clara," he said as he lifted his hand to the tree. "You must release the Nutcracker from his spell. Only you have the power of a pure and loving heart." I felt the sofa beneath me begin to tremble. Beside me, the tree rumbled as if brought to life by the bizarre hour. The ground shook, the walls moved too, threatening to drop the many frames to the hardwood floor, and I was helpless to stop it. My heart raced, sure to burst from my chest if the house did right itself. I wanted to scream. My eyes caught sight again of Uncle Drosselmeyer. He was waving his hands wildly, stirring his fingers in the air as if instructing an orchestra to reach a crescendo. The strangeness did not end there, for the tree had suddenly grown taller. I jumped up from the sofa and ran toward my uncle, but as I reached for the lapels of his jacket to insist he explain himself, he dissolved into nothing. He was gone. "Clara!" My name came from the other side of the room. I turned, finding my uncle now beside the large fireplace. In his hands was the Nutcracker. He lowered the wooden soldier onto the floor, beside the glowing, dying embers of the hearth. "You must break the spell, Clara." Break the spell? Was he speaking of the story he had once told me as a child? The very story Anton and I had spoken of earlier in the hallway? I took a step back, easing away from him. Perhaps if I made it back to the stairwell, I would turn to find it had all been a part of my imagination. If only I could reach the staircase. As I tried to turn my feet back to where I had come from, I realized I was frozen in place. I squeezed my eyes shut. Perhaps I was dreaming. Perhaps, if I willed myself to awaken, then it would have all been a terrible dream. But this dream appeared to have no end. As I opened my eyes again, the room had actually grown larger all around me. I raced to the sofa again, digging my fingers into the plush fabric. My stomach twisted into what felt like knots as I shrank down. It felt like I was falling down further and further into the dream. Could this truly be happening? I pinched myself, again and again, but it was useless. Wake up, Clara, wake up! Uncle Drosselmeyer! I called out loudly, hoping I would awaken the house as I wrapped my arms around my head. I hoped that either Mama or Papa would hear me and come down to the parlor to find me. I wanted nothing more than to awaken from this strange nightmare. Please, Uncle Drosselmeyer, I'm afraid! And then suddenly, the room came to an abrupt halt. All was quiet. I could hear the soft, steady ticking of the grandfather clock again. I eased my arms away, glancing around the space I recognized. But everything was different. I was different. The sofa loomed far over me, and the tree in the corner of the room, large and foreboding. Break the spell! Beware of the Mouse King! Uncle Drosselmeyer's voice echoed so softly from far away. Where had he gone? He couldn't just leave me here like this. Uncle Drosselmeyer! I called out, biting back an unpleasant curse as I pushed myself up to my feet. I needed to find him. Uncle! As I scurried from one rung of the sofa to the next, I found I was desperate for air. I could see the glow burning from the last of the embers in the fireplace from where I stood, and I could see him, the Nutcracker. As the furniture and the tree had grown larger, he now matched my height. Legends say the Nutcracker represents strength and power. It serves to protect its owner from evil spirits and danger. If I was to break the spell to help save the Nutcracker, could he protect me in turn? Could the story of the Nutcracker be true? I ran across the room to him, a distance that moments before would have been only a few mere steps. Now it felt like an eternity. With each step, I felt my head spinning. I paused as I approached his still form. The Nutcracker was unmoving, though he stood proud in place. Reaching out carefully, I grazed a finger over his arm. As soon as my fingers brushed over the painted wood, another curtain of glitter rained over us. Uncle Drosselmeyer. I tilted my chin upward towards the ceiling, but saw nothing. The sounds of the Nutcracker shifting and tilting startled me, drawing my attention back to him. Right before my eyes, he began to transform. His rounded arms became more defined with fingers and elbows. The crinkle in his clothing was real, and the fabric had changed as well. And when he opened his eyes, I gasped. 2 blue irises looked back at me curiously. Human eyes stared back at me. Eyes that had once been painted onto the surface of his face now moved like any other normal person's. Nutcracker? I asked, lifting my brow in confusion. Clara? He gasped as his wooden jaw began to move more freely on its own. You're my Nutcracker? I almost laughed at myself, the realization that I must be dreaming, a relief. I could suddenly feel myself growing faint. The room around me was becoming darker, and the air. It was hard to breathe. My legs buckled beneath me as I fell onto the floor. Clara, the Nutcracker said again as he took a step forward. His hands reached out slowly, as if I were a skittish animal in dire need of calming. His voice cracked as if he had been sleeping and finally woken. It was a familiar tune, the lull of his drawl as he accented my name. It was smooth, like hot chocolate, and familiar, though I couldn't place it. I knew he was a friend, though. He had said my name as though he had spent years perfecting it. His boots thumped against the wooden floorboard, loud and sudden amidst the quiet. I sat in a heap on the floor, the fabric of my dressing robe tangled around my legs. I couldn't bring myself to say any of the thoughts racing through my mind, to admit out loud that this was actually happening and, indeed, wasn't a dream. He was real. The story was real. Carefully, he knelt before me and offered me his hand. As he waited, I gazed over his features. His kind, soft eyes were reminiscent of the boy I had seen in my dream. I took the Nutcracker's offered hand, astonished by the strangeness of his cool touch. Though he appeared more human now, he was still truly made of wood, just like the dancing dolls I had witnessed earlier at the party. I peeked a glance at his back, wondering if I would find a brass key like the others had. "Where is Uncle Drosselmeyer?" I asked him as I turned my gaze away to search the impossibly large room again. It was incredibly surreal to be so small, especially when the only thing that had loomed over me before was the possibility of an unwanted marriage. Now I was smaller than our furniture, and the fear of being stepped on was greater than ever. I needed to find my uncle and make him undo what magic he had done. Across the sea of rugs, hard wood, and shadows, there was no trace of my uncle. He and his billowing cape were gone. Not a trace of him anywhere. "I don't understand," I admitted, shaking my head. Clara, He worked his jaw with strained effort as if he were trying to form his next words. But before he could speak them, a rustling sound came from behind me. I turned, startled from the noise. "What was that?" I whispered, easing myself behind him as slowly as possible. The Nutcracker reached for his waist, swiftly pulling a sword from a scabbard I had not seen. The strange metal glistened in the faint light emanating from the glowing fireplace. Shadows danced all around us, taking odd shapes and sizes. Something skittered across the floor, scraping and pattering like little feet. And a lot of them. If I listened to the sounds a little closer, I could make out the softest squeaking. Like mice. And it was coming from underneath the Christmas tree. "Mice?" I asked as I raised my brows curiously. "But we don't have mice." "It appears that you do," the Nutcracker murmured as he lifted his arm protectively, as if to shield me from the approaching enemy. "Stay close." There was a sort of warmth to his voice I hadn't noticed, a sense of comfort and protection despite the lurking danger. I was suddenly struck with the memory of Uncle Drosselmeyer's words. "Beware of the Mouse King." The reality of my suddenly new height reminded me that I was as tall as a mouse now, if not smaller. Suddenly the sword in the Nutcracker's hand appeared much sharper than it had before. I gulped down my fears, hoping that I had not become so small just to be swallowed up whole.